Hello, Combination. My name is Subhi Saadeh. I've spent over a decade in medical device, pharma, and combination product development. Our industry feels complicated sometimes. Drugs, devices, clinical trials, submissions, sterilization, validation, design control, risk management, market access, reimbursement. The list goes on. My goal is mastery, so this podcast is to ask questions I have to people who may have the answers. Each week on the Combinate podcast, I talk to someone about their area to further understand and simplify. Whether you're a pharma person trying to understand the next wave of products, or a device person trying to navigate a pharma system you're unfamiliar with, or a newbie in both areas, I invite you to listen, and together we can simplify by combinating.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Global Medical Device Podcast. My name is Etienne Nichols, and today with me to talk about combination products and just the industry in general of the combination product industry is Subhi Saadeh. He is the host of the Combinate podcast, exploring the world of combination products. With over a decade of experience in the pharmaceutical and medical device industries, Subhi is a leading expert on the unique challenges and opportunities presented by products that combine drugs, devices, and/or biologics. Subhi serves currently as the International Committee Chair for the Combination Products Coalition, or the CPC, and as a member of ASTM Committee E55, and also served as a committee member on AAMI's, that's AAMI, AAMI's Combination Products Committee. I will throw one other thing out because I know Subhi is an Ironman triathlete and a marathoner and ultra marathoner, which I think is super cool. So I love hearing him talk about those things. Subhi holds a Bachelor of Science in Biomedical Engineering from the University of Illinois, is an ASQ certified quality engineer, and holds an ISO 13445 lead auditor certification from BSI. Those are the highlights that I found, but Subhi, what did I miss, or did I get anything wrong?
As we're getting started here at Etienne, I did want to say all opinions expressed here only represent me, Subhi, N of one, and no other organizations, entities. And I'd say the one maybe major correction there is that I'm certainly not an expert and definitely not a leading expert, but I would say as part of my podcasting journey, I've talked to a lot of experts and really grateful to be on the show. Huge fan, been a long time listener, actually back to the John Spear days, and I'm a big fan of you as a host as well.
Really cool. Well, I really appreciate having you on the podcast. I'm excited to have this conversation today because you have 139 episodes. That's a lot of episodes. Curious if you could talk to us about what sparked the idea for the Combinate podcast.
Yeah, I had just had my second kid and was just in this kind of I don't know, nebulous spot mentally. And I was thinking about like what my values are, what I'm trying to learn. I was getting ghosted by people that I really wanted to talk to and respected. I'd always been really good at networking, but I felt like as I got to the manager level in big pharma and was trying to reach out to more people in like the senior director, VP space, their time was more limited. And basically, I wasn't getting the time of day.
Yeah.
And it was during COVID. And I'm like, there was a lot of things going on in the background, right? I had just had my second kid. I was thinking about, well, yeah, as you have your fourth on the way, you go through, it's not like you grow in a linear progression. It's the same thing when it comes to racing and fitness. Learning is also the same way. So I was in this spot where I was just in a really reflective place. And I was thinking about, well, what do I want out of my career? What do I want to learn? And this thought that was in my head that I just couldn't get out was, if I want to be a master at my craft, I need to be producing something in a way that is consistent. I'm very good at maintaining habits. I'm disciplined, I know that, but I'm not putting myself in a situation where I'm producing almost for the sake of producing as an exercise. Said, well, I could start a blog to have that become habitual.
Sure.
I was thinking about what I could do, and I'm like, I got the gift of gab like nobody's business.
It's true.
I can talk people's ear off. And so it became a 2 or 3 bird, 1 stone kind of thing where I was able to produce something in a way that was consistent and challenge myself, continue to learn, pay yourself first in terms of learning and prioritizing that. If people are expecting an episode a week and I've set that expectation, then I need to devote at least an hour to a week to producing something. Secondary to that was my ability to connect with people and reach out, get advice and that. And I would also add, we were talking before we started recording, my father passed away when I was young. And so for a long time, I had this itch that I wanted scratched where I would want people's advice and people's guidance and things like that. As I grew older. And so that includes career, relationship, life, and so on. And so that for me was very meaningful and it's been great.
That's really fantastic. I respect that a lot, especially the production for production's sake. And I'm curious if you have been able to identify maybe some of the ways you've changed or the way producing this has impacted you. Maybe, I don't know if it's a guest or an episode or just the process in general, just however you want to tackle that.
I've become a lot more efficient. So I think you said earlier that like, oh, it takes a lot of work. I think it may be perceived as it takes a lot of work, but it doesn't take that long. Even if I'm producing a solo episode where I'm just researching a topic, putting together a script and then recording it, like I feel like I could turn it around in like 2 hours.
Yeah.
And especially with a lot of tools that are available, it doesn't take that long. And as my brother's a lot faster than me in terms of racing, right? I'm heavy and slow. But as you become more and more fit, the long runs actually take less time. And so like I follow people on Strava, right? And I'll see them knock out a 20-mile run in like 2 hours. And that's their long run for the week.
Yeah.
All their other runs are shorter,
Yeah.
right? Whereas for me to do the 20 miles, it may take me closer to 4 hours.
Right.
And so I think it's just the natural progression of things as you become better and sharper, you become more efficient and it takes a lot less time. And so that's just speaking broadly, but in terms of creative process, I've tried to automate the stuff that I can as much as possible. So like I typically have an intake form that I have people fill out, like what are the things that you definitely want to talk about? What are things you don't want to talk about? If they have a bio they'd like to, I love the bio that you gave. Like I need that for sure. The summary was nice. So I try and have my guest do as much of the work as possible because this is something that I realized too, is people are nervous about how they're talked about. And so it unnerves them if they're providing me the bio that's going to go in the show notes. Like it's a win-win where I don't have to put together the bio and they know what's going to go into the show notes. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I use a tool called Descript, which really helps with my editing. I don't know if you use that.
Yep.
10 out
Yeah.
of 10, maybe the best money I've spent. And I always just look, that's like the thought that I have is I plan on doing this forever.
Yeah.
Okay, there's no end goal in mind. And so there's no end timeline, I should say, in mind. And so from that point of view, for me to do it for the long haul, I need to make it as easy as possible
Yeah.
so that it becomes near impossible for me to miss.
Right. Either as easy or as pleasurable. You have to smear that all the rough edges for sure. Yeah.
For sure. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I could talk about podcasts all day, and maybe someday we're gonna have to do a podcast on podcasts. That gets meta. But let's move on to the combination products topic. And I didn't ask you to do this, but I wonder if you could give maybe an overview of combination products just so that we can level set with the audience. Do you want to give I don't know, we need to set up some boundaries as to what we're talking about when we talk about combination products.
So it's really funny. You had Susan Needle on
Mhm.
before, right? After she published her book. And one of the things that she's working on through ASTM is a harmonized set of definitions for combination products. And I think that's one of the challenging areas is around just the philosophy of what is and isn't considered a combination product. So I'll just talk about the FDA and the EU. So in the US, it's a combination of two entities, a drug device, biologic device, or a biologic drug. And in the EU, they take a little bit of a different approach where in the EU, drugs are called medicinal products and medical devices are medical devices. And I think rather than going through the actual definitions,
Yeah.
I'll speak to the regulatory frameworks just of the two. In the US, the reason that those regulatory definitions of drug versus device matter is because you have CDRH, which is the center that focuses on devices. You have CBER, which focuses on biologics, CDER, which focuses on drugs, and you have the Office of Combination Products, which tries to work through the management of which office should be the lead reviewer. And one of the Office of Combination Products' main responsibilities is handling the requests for designations for, is it a combination product? Is it device-led? Is it drug-led? And so on. In the EU, it's a different model where the competent authorities are responsible for the drug reviews, and EMA is the European Medicines Agency, but they farm out the notified body opinion that's required under the EU MDR Article 117 and have the notified bodies do that review and that be an input into the review of the drug as part of the competent authority review. And
Okay.
so with from that perspective, when you look at the definitions in the regulation, you can see like, oh, this is how it's supposed to be reviewed. So the definitions start to make a little bit more sense. But I do think one thing that I think is a problem in terms of harmonization is just the recognition of, is it a combination product or is it not? And so you have the US and the EU, some countries that have started to introduce definitions for combination products, but then you have countries that don't even acknowledge it conceptually, and it's just drug or device.
Yeah. And you mentioned the different branches of the FDA that will handle different sections of the combination product. And so one of the difficulties that I think some of us in the industry get into is the thinking, okay, well, okay, I have a device and I have a biologic or a drug, or maybe all three. I suppose that's the fourth option of a combination product. And it's which entity am I going to submit my or will my submission go through? The primary mode of action is what determines that. The primary mode of action as far as what part of the combination product is actually mitigating or diagnosing or treating the disease. What happens when for the if you have the drug constituent as the PMOA, what happens with the device constituent? And how does that get reviewed from a regulatory standpoint? Can you speak to that?
You mean in terms of like a pre-market approval?
Yeah, pre-market approval or
This is my understanding, and I wouldn't say it's, I'm not a regulatory I actually, if I had a nickel for every time I said I'm not a regulatory person, I say it in the industry meetings when for the international working group, I say it a lot that
yeah.
I'm not a regulatory person. I
What do you call yourself? I'll let
I would say quality more than anything.
okay.
Yeah.
So what do you think?
But so in terms of review, I should say that you submit through the, at least if it's drug led. Most of my experience has been drug led, so I can't really speak to device led. If you're following a drug led, you're using the CTD format, the Common Technical Document format, and you're putting some of the device related elements into the CTD format. There's expectations on where those go, and those sections are reviewed by the appropriate sort of device center.
Okay.
For and there's a group within FDA that is responsible within CDRH, I should say, that's responsible for reviewing those, say, functional performance characteristics and that are part of a drug-led combination
Okay.
product.
And I'd like to know what you consider to be some of the biggest misconceptions in drug device integration and so on, or maybe what are some of the biggest difficulties when you have a combination product? You know, I almost want to revise that question and zoom out. Do you see combination product, the industry as a whole growing? Because it feels like it's growing, but I don't know what I'm basing that off of.
I think it's certainly growing. More and more companies investing time, energy, and resources into growing it. And I think just with the move towards a lot more home use, you're seeing, I think, a lot more investment. There's a lot more manufacturing footprint in terms of the CXOs. There's a lot more familiarity. So I think where you may have needed to build out a line to have your first combination product, that's a little bit easier to do nowadays. And so there's less, say, resistance towards technical or regulatory risk, I think, because of that. And I think it's just a bigger focus, right?
Mhm.
Like at least I used to work in the generic space, and they would call these kinds of technologies differentiated drug delivery. And so if you have an existing drug, how do you add value to it? You differentiate its ability to how you
Yeah.
deliver it. So
Instead
if
of a
you need
manual
to
syringe, maybe a button push or something,
pre-filled
or on
syringe
body.
or
Yeah.
pen or yeah.
Okay. Interesting. One of the things that I remember being a difficult when I first started getting interested in combination products was co-packed versus single packed versus single entity. I don't know if you can speak to that or if you can elucidate on that subject any.
Yeah, and so now you're getting into sort of the second level of definitions. And this is where the US and EU definitions start to differ, but I'll focus on the ones that you mentioned.
Sure.
Single entity is integrated, where like a pre-filled syringe, you have a primary container that includes a device, and once you open the package, you take the product out, it's all there. So pre-filled syringe, auto injector, pen injector, those are single entity. Co-packaged are things like kits, where you open up the box and it has maybe the vial. It could be a vial of lyophilized drug, another vial of diluent, a syringe, a vial adapter, whatever, a needle, and a set of instructions on how to use the product. It could just be a vial and syringe. That's a really simple co-pack, but everything you need to use in the box is in the box, and you're effectively being told, use this component with this drug,
Okay.
use this device with this drug. And the third one is cross-labeled, where you're told, use this product specifically with this other standalone device.
Okay.
And so this is intended for use with this only. And I've seen that. I used to work in medical devices only, like my background is all medical device basically. And you'd see that with devices where you have like a hardware and it says only used with the disposables. And so that's similar to cross-labeled, where they both say use with each other.
Okay. You mentioned the different layers of definitions within combination products, and I do think definitions is one of the biggest hurdles to overcome when it comes to a new person coming into the combination product industry. I'm sure there's a lot more. There's some technical difficulties to overcome as well, but definitions is certainly one of those hurdles. How many layers of would we need to go to fully
I,
understand?
I don't think that this is like this is just how I think about it, in that
Yeah.
there is no like level one combo product definition, level two. It's just when I think drug led, device led, that's you're saying one characteristic about the combination product.
Mhm.
And when you say single integral, or you're saying integrated versus cross-labeled versus co-packaged, you're saying something else.
Yeah.
And so that's all I was
Yeah.
trying to say.
No, that makes sense. What do you think are some of the biggest misconceptions or the biggest pitfalls that someone needs to overcome when it comes to entering this industry?
When it comes to combination products specifically,
Yeah.
I don't know that I'd call it a misconception. I think that as part of my podcast, I've gotten to get a lot of different perspectives.
Yeah.
One of the things that I don't like is that sometimes device people are used to a certain way, and they go into pharma and things are done a little bit differently. And they think that because they do things differently, they don't know how to do devices. And I see this where, people who are legacy devices will come into a pharma company and they will try to be understood before they understand. And I think that one of the misconceptions, in my opinion, and of one, this opinion only represents me, is that drugs and device are super different. And one of the people that I love that I've gotten to meet through my podcast is Larry Mager. He was actually on your show a while back, where I think you guys talked about management review or management
Yeah.
responsibility. He's a quality guy. And he was after he got introduced into combination products in the last couple of years. And he said this on my podcast. He said drugs are not really a lot different than devices. What's different is how they measure product quality. And I really like that because we get into the part four and the nuances between the QMS differences and stuff like that. And the reality is that's the framework that was set up because of how the regulations were written. So you have a set of pharma regulations, you have a set of device regulations. This is how they were bridged in the current situation, right? And that's a regulatory legislation
Yeah.
concern. It's not a product quality concern. There are differences in terms of how you measure devices and drugs, but I don't think that entering it from it, it's a product.
They might not have been philosophically different had they been allowed to evolve on their own in the industry without regulatory oversight to a certain extent. Statistical sampling,
No, no,
for
no.
example.
That's not what I was saying. I was saying more that the way that and I really like part four actually, but the
Sure.
way that's set up is against the backdrop of what was set up before.
Yeah. And I'm not saying it's a
It's
bad
not,
thing.
it's not because drugs and devices are inherently different. It's,
Yeah.
in my opinion, because of how the drug and device regulations and system was set up
Yeah.
prior.
So having said that, you mentioned part four. I can't remember when did it come out? 2013. I think I looked this
Yeah.
up at one point. Anyway, a while back. There's a recent update to it with QMSR. It seems like it flew under the radar a little bit. Everybody's talking about how 21 CFR Part 820 is changing, but 21 CFR Part 4 is changing slightly as well. I wonder, have you looked into that? Can you speak to it any?
I did a whole solo episode on QMSR and so actually I put out another episode recently on a couple of the guidances that came out through EMA and another one through FDA on platforms. I found personally, so going back to learning,
Well,
that
we'll
just
put links in the show notes, by the way, to
yeah.
those episodes so people can
Yeah,
find those.
so basically there's one where I just go through the QMSR just to read it and some of the observation. Basically, I wanted to have a few guests on to talk through QMSR, but I didn't want to just ask them what's changing,
Yeah,
right? Without actually reading it in detail. And so I did an episode where I did read it in detail and use that to prep for those. And so there's maybe 3 or 4 episodes just focused on QMSR that folks can check out and the differences, all of these things are in the weeds, right? So
sure.
I wouldn't
Yeah.
want to speak to it.
What I'd like to get into is how are there any specific episodes or specific guests that really stand out that you've learned that maybe you wouldn't have come across had you not interviewed that person? When you think about your podcast and what you've done.
Yeah, and so that's you and I have actually talked about this before. I think one of the beauties of combination products, why I love it so much, is you can focus on pharma topics and be under within the folder of combination products. You can focus on device topics, be within the same folder of device, be under combination products, and you can focus on combination products and still be. And so there's a lot that I was just going through the list of episodes
I know.
yesterday or a couple days ago, and I was like, what are some things that I would have not really been able to learn if I was just focused on the day-to-day work. So I did an episode with Michelle Lott on FOIA
Oh
and
yeah.
basically
I'm not
FOIA,
familiar.
Freedom of Information Act.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah, and what is accessible, what's not accessible, what to expect, what is the timeline, and so that was something that I would have never really needed to, but I remember being in a conversation and hearing like an issue with FOIA requests. And so I'm like, I know Michelle posts a lot about FOIA and some of the stuff that um she's gathered through that. And so I did an episode on that's one of those like oddball things that I would have never spent time on. Temperature mapping, another one. I've done 4 or maybe 5 episodes on sterilization methods. And so I did one on steam sterilization, one on irradiation, one on gas sterilization, and one on novel sterilization methods, waste management, how to deal with a lot of the kind of lab waste that happens and what the regulations are with that.
Can I interject just for a moment to go back to
Yeah.
sterilization? Not to get too detailed with it, but I know there's a big push away from ETO right now, and a lot of people are into gamma or yeah, how to say this. I think
Prioritizing it. Yeah.
yeah, but there's an even more environmental friendly way that I just like to bring up to people, and I'm forgetting it right now. I want to say it's
E-beam.
not E-beam. Oh, hydrogen or
Oh, VHP, vaporized hydrogen peroxide.
yeah, I think that could be it. Do you have an opinion on the different methods, such as
Not an
hydrogen
expert,
method?
not an expert in it.
We'll put an episode link to one of those because I think there's some interesting things coming out with sterilization. But anyway, go on.
For sure.
You've got a lot of different things here.
Market access.
Yeah.
Not, I've done a handful of episodes on that, something that I would have never needed to really get. Scientific, non-scientific speech. And one thing that's talked about a lot is the drug marketing, the different laws and
Yeah.
approaches internationally. And so I've done 2 episodes on that, one on scientific speech, one on non-scientific speech. And yeah, I think it's basically if whenever I hear of a topic, I just put a pin in it and I will spend a
Yeah.
few minutes on LinkedIn and be like, hey, who can teach me about this?
There was, and I love that approach, and I love the broad range of topics that you've covered. It's pretty impressive.
Yeah, well, I like I said, I don't really, there's no real like method to it. I'm not like, here are the topics that I'm going to cover. It's usually just based on curiosity.
Follow.
I find that to be really interesting because we get so focused on the technical. And I think it's like in every quality manual, there's the pyramid.
Hmm.
You know what I'm talking about?
Yep.
That like how a bill becomes a law kind of thing. Starts with regulation, then standards, then internal standards, then or excuse me, then internal policies and so on and so forth down to SOPs and work instructions and that. I think there's another pyramid that's on top of that.
Yeah.
And regulations come from somewhere.
I love that pyramid above the pyramid that you're mentioning because it's making me think almost. So you go up to the regulation, you read the regulation, you go up to the legislation, whatever act that or bill that was passed that influenced that regulation, but then you go above that and beyond and say, okay, well, what is happening in the industry that's causing this group of people to say we need legislation for this? I think about the changes with QMSR to globally harmonize Part 820 with ISO 1345 or the LDT ruling that will now consider laboratory developed tests as IVDs. So there's something that's happened potentially that has influenced the government to try to change how the industry is approaching this. So I'm coming to a point here. I'll stop this TED talk here in just a second. But if we're able to see those trends and go all the way up the chain to that, you could potentially be the teacher to those people enforcing or writing those legislative acts to say, I know you're on several different committees, but I've seen this particularly with the LDT proposed and final ruling where people in the industry are trying to educate those people at the top so that whatever does come down the chain is not going to negatively impact the industry. So I think that's an interesting responsibility that a medtech professional could take on themselves by approaching the legislation this way from this triangle that you're talking about. It's really interesting.
And I think there's it's funny. There's one episode I did with someone I really look up to. Her name is Jane True, and she talked about the Minto method
Okay.
in terms of how she puts together presentations. She was a management consultant, I think, for a part of her career, and I've seen her present, and her presentations are amazing. And so she introduced me to this concept of Minto, and Minto uses pyramids. And so I kind of joke because I'm Middle Eastern that whenever I present, you'll probably see a pyramid. And so a lot of times I write on an iPad. And so a lot of times I'll have like a hand-drawn pyramid in a lot of my presentations. But I think when you talk about the differences in terms of being able to influence, there's the sort of bottom rung of the ladder where you do advocacy, where you're trying to influence, for example, guidances and things like that. And then you go up the chain into trying to influence policy in terms of regulation, lobbying, and so on as you go up the chain all the way up to legislation.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to put a link in the show notes to that as well. We're going to have a lot of links in the show notes of those
Yeah.
listening. This is your jumping off point into both combination product and Subi's podcast. So, one other question I might have because you do a lot of endurance training, it seems like, and I love your office setup and the things that you've got going on. I'm curious how you balance technical and business aspects. I don't know if you have any suggestions or secrets or advice.
I'd say I have almost no business acumen and little technical, but I'm good at following a plan. I don't think I remember once I was sitting down with someone that has had a lot of life experience, and I was It was after I had my first kid and she was going through a sleep regression. And I was just asking him how he balances things because he has 5 or 6 kids, right? And he goes, balance is not like this, balance is like this.
Mm.
And so basically get this idea out of your head that it's going to be, if I give everything equal time, then um, I'll be good money. And basically what I started to try to do a little bit more, and I'm not amazing at it by any means, is just focusing on, is this something that gives me energy or is it something that doesn't? And so, for example, I'll record a podcast for a half hour or 45 minutes and I'll be ultra productive that day. Like if I'm recording in the morning, I'm like, I got juice for the whole day.
Yeah.
And then another day it may not be so. And so I find that for me, like running or lifting or something like that, it's a green activity. I'm usually more buzzed and excited after doing it.
Yeah.
And I just try and do that. I will say for me, what's been just tremendously helpful is having a coach. And I try and have coaching mentors because it's one thing to try and go and do something. It's another thing to try and figure out the appropriate course of action, program it, and then go and do it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I love that idea. I've had different types of coaches over the years, but I'm curious what your approach is. And do you mean to coach more than just from a physical standpoint, from a career standpoint, or how do you, can you elaborate a little bit?
I think generally, like the coaching is just paid advice, right? So whether it's podcast coaching, I hired a podcast coach for a couple of months and they were really helpful in just helping me optimize. I have a coach for endurance training that helped me do my Ironman last year. And I brought him back because I just found that I was spending a lot of time trying to figure out how to program things. And is it 3 days this and 4 days that? And it was just a lot of mental energy that was unnecessarily spent. And so now what I'm working with him on is just figuring out for the long haul, what does a good system look like that I can just plug and play. And then eventually, I think the goal of any coach is to work themselves out of your life. And sometimes you need a coach for a year, sometimes you only need them for a couple months. But I think broadly speaking, I think it's great to have coaching, paid or unpaid guidance in
Yeah.
any area that you can. Like it's a balance, right, between trying on your own. But at least in my own life progression, I spent a lot of time trying on my own and running in place before I got to the point where I'm like, I know I'm a hard worker, I know I'm disciplined, and so those two things combined with getting guidance and coaching and that is really helpful. I think I have seen with some people where they are so into the idea of getting guidance and coaching that it may be the opposite, where
Yeah.
it's stopping. I'm usually in the position where I know I'm going to be doing something, and if I find myself running in place for a long time, I think it's time for guidance because it's
Yeah.
not working.
Yeah. Reach that ceiling before you hire someone to help you break out, make it taller.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah, I like that. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, let's go back to combination products just briefly. I want to ask you a question to see if there's anything we should be thinking about. Are there any trends or anything that would be helpful for people to know about that you've just seen or been aware of? And I'll define how I look at trends versus fads. And so fads I look at as just waves in the ocean that, hey, if you can ride them, but trends are the tide that you can't fight. It's coming.
I don't know that I would call it a trend. It's maybe more of a hope. One of the companies that I worked at started getting to this point where they realized that having standalone device groups within a pharma company was an inefficient way to manage combination product development. And it's not that you don't need those device experts, but setting them up in a way where, oh, they're this different group and not doing a full mapping into the organization, full mapping into your product development process, full mapping into your QMS where it's just integrated. They are no different than anyone else. I think that my hope is that the attitude will change to be a little bit more holistic. But I think just given how growing pains naturally happen, you need to have them be
Yeah.
separate before you can mend them together.
I like that. That is a good hope. I respect that. And having worked in a combination product company myself, I can see the different perspectives. And so they're very, really valuable. But if they are by themselves, they don't really get that crossover pollination. To think about, I guess one more show note link that I'd like to have. Is there an episode that you look back on over all of the 139 episodes you've done and you think, hey, if you're going to listen to one of my episodes, check this one out because man, this one was good. Is there a favorite?
Um, I won't say an interview because it's like trying to pick who's your favorite kid. So I would say all of the guests have had an impact on me for sure. And and so I won't say that. I will say this, Quality is Free is maybe maybe the best book I've ever read. One
Crosby?
for sure. Yeah, Phil Crosby. I would say it's top three, including things like religious books and things like it's one of my favorite books ever. And so I did an episode on Quality is Free. And so I think people, if I were to say one episode to check out, I'd say that. And just because I would hope that it would inspire you to read the book, because I think it's a great book.
You mentioned books in general. What would be your favorite book, either to gift somebody or to, or that someone has recommended to you?
Quality is Free.
Okay.
If you want another one, I can give you plenty of others, but I like Mastery by Robert Greene. I like, what is it called? The Viktor Frankl book.
Oh, yes. Man's Search for Meaning.
Man's Search for Meaning. I love that book.
Yes.
Naveen Agarwal recommended it to me. Really loved that book.
Really? Okay. Yeah, read that book many years ago and actually read The Diary of Anne Frank right before going to Amsterdam. And that was pretty impactful for me, just as the father of a daughter now. That was pretty impactful. So that's a good one. Okay, if there's one thing you would want the
I would
audience,
say if I can
yeah,
add
yeah,
one more book,
please.
Bottle of Lies is a good book if you work in pharma. It's a New York Times bestseller written by Catherine Ebon. I actually interviewed her. And she has a whole there's a lot of the book that's focused on this FDA inspector named Peter Baker, who I also interviewed. And that was such a cool episode, just hearing his perspective, some of the stuff that he was able to uncover in his inspections overseas. So that book is really good and it reads like a story, even though it's all true.
Wow. Yeah, okay. Definitely gonna include that in the show notes. So 2 episodes on that book, basically.
The second one was a lot more also on data integrity
Yeah,
with the
Peter Baker. Okay, very cool. If there's one thing you'd want the audience to walk away with, what would that one thing be?
Yeah, I would say that maybe just going back to how I got started. So one of the big sort of growth spurt moments happened for me as I was starting the show, and I was working at Pfizer at the time, and was trying to figure out, well, if, for example, I wanted to write an article about acceptance sampling or something that's whatever, or talk about a guidance document, like what are the guardrails? And I tend to be pretty risk averse when it comes to, you actually put out an episode, you put out a couple videos and you talked about how you're self-conscious, I think, when it comes to videos,
Yeah, a
right?
little bit.
Yeah, me too, for sure.
Yeah.
I'm exactly like that. And so one thing that was just like pound into my head is doing things like blogging or podcasting or publishing articles or whatever. You're not doing anything wrong by doing that. And I remember meeting with the non-clinical publishing team and saying, hey, I have this idea of a podcast. Like, what would I need to do? And they're like, are you going to talk about any Pfizer products? And I'm like, no. Like, are you going to talk about any Pfizer processes? No. And so
Yeah.
it was just that. And so I recorded a couple episodes and I sent it and got it more formally cleared. I talked to legal, I talked to the social media team and all of that. And it was like across the board. If you're that's and actually when I talked to the non-clinical publishing team, that what the guy told me is like, to be part of people's jobs is actually publishing. And so
Interesting.
another way to think about it is like, for some people, this is like a requirement. Like I'd be asking them, what have you published?
Yeah.
And so I would just obviously you have to have good sense, right? But at the same time, you're not doing anything wrong by learning and publishing or posting on LinkedIn and that.
Yeah, being a lifelong learner is so valuable. And companies that recognize that, I think, are the best companies. If they recognize their employees are striving to learn and really teaching others is one of the best ways you can really instill that knowledge into yourself. So writing it down. I have a saying that I don't know where I got this saying. I know it didn't come from me, but I never knew what I thought until I wrote it down. And I'm a believer in writing for that reason, because I never really know exactly what I think until I write it. And I think it's similar with this publishing. So I think that's a really great piece of advice. Produce something for the sake of production and pursue your curiosity like you have. It's really cool. Where can people find you?
LinkedIn, the podcast website is letscombinate.com. All the episodes are there. If you have any topics you'd like covered or guests that you feel like would be, actually, I will say some of my best guests have actually reached out to me. And yeah, so if you feel like you'd be a great guest or have a topic that you feel like would be great, feel free to reach out.
Yeah. And I will reemphasize what he said, because it is so valuable when people reach out, even just from a listener standpoint, and say, "Hey, I'd love it if you cover this topic." That is really valuable feedback. So I'm sure he'd love to hear that. As a fellow podcaster, I personally really appreciate it when people recommend topics. Thank you so much, Subhi. I really appreciate it. This has been fun. I hope everybody will check out the show notes. In the meantime, really appreciate you all listening. We'll let you guys get back to the rest of your day, and take care. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, Etienne.